Good morning, everyone. I will introduce myself first. My name is Lin Ying from the Chinese University Press. On behalf of the press, I want to extend a very warm welcome to everyone here for joining us for this very special and exciting event. As many of you have known, we recently published the Chinese edition of Secretary Paulson's new book, Dealing with China, in which he details and shares with us very nicely his first-hand experience of dealing with China over the past 2 decades. Today, we are truly honored to have Secretary Paulson here with Professor Lawrence Lau, having a nice conversation on an exciting and inspiring book on the rising new global power, and on the most important, I think Secretary Paulson probably will agree, the most important bilateral relationship in the global perspective. So with very special excitement, we have today Dr. Fred Hu to introduce the 2 honorable speakers. But I will say a few words about Dr. Hu first. Dr. Hu, surprisingly, he held a master's degree in engineering science from Tsinghua University in China, and a master's degree and a PhD in economics from Harvard University. Currently, he's the founder and chairman of the Primavera Capital Group since 2010. Between 1997 to 2010, he works as the chief China economist and the chairman of Greater China Group at Goldman Sachs Group. And later he founded his own capital group company. So please join me to invite Dr. Hu to introduce our 2 distinguished speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Yin. Good morning, students, faculty members, friends, and guests. It is my tremendous pleasure to introduce to you 2 very special people, 2 gentlemen I have known for decades and admire and regard as my mentor and dear friends. First, Professor Larry Lau. Larry, I guess, really doesn't need introduction here. Many of you already know he has a long and distinguished academic career in both the United States and here in Hong Kong. He was for many years a senior faculty member at Stanford, having held the first continuity professorship of economic development at Stanford. And he served as vice chancellor or president, as more commonly known in the US, of this preeminent institution, Chinese University of Hong Kong. He still holds the Claire and Ralph Landau Chair, Professor of Economics here at the CUHK. Being a top scholar in his field, Larry is also a widely sought after advisor to government leaders and business sector alike. Now, let me turn to Secretary Paulson. Of course, you may have read his official biography, but to me, Hank just simply an inspiring leader, a very supportive mentor, and a dear friend. The thing I guess I really want to highlight about Hank is the fact he has been such a stauncher and influential promoter of a close and strong bilateral relationship between China and the United States. For 3 decades, Hank has been proactively engaged with China. He has traveled to China for over 100 times. I think this record should be much higher. I used to keep track, but now I have lost track of the number of his trips to China. He has developed deep relationships with 3 generations of Chinese leaders, from President Jiang Zemin, Premier Zhu Yongji, to President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang today. And he has been a trusted advisor and partner to Chinese CEOs of these big state-owned companies, to private sector entrepreneurs like Pony Ma and Jack Ma. Hank was instrumental in establishing the International Advisory Board for Tsinghua University and helped launch the first executive education program in partnership with the Harvard Business School there. Hank took the conservation expertise and the resources of the Nature Conservancy to China and helped establish China's first national park in Yunnan province. While serving as the 74th Secretary of Treasury in the US government, Hank established the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, commonly known as SED, between the two countries. This SED mechanism remains a crucially important forum for policy communications, managing differences and disputes, and fostering trust between the two countries. After retiring from government, Hank has not retired from public service. He continues to dedicate himself to promoting US-China relationship and the partnership through the Paulson Institute, a think and do tank at the University of Chicago. There's no senior Western leader in business or in politics who has had such a long and productive history of engagement with China as Secretary Paulson has. Maybe the only exception I could make is Dr. Henry Kissinger in terms of the length of history of engagement with China. But no one has had such a broad-based impact on China across so many areas in business and finance, in government and diplomacy, in education and conservation. And no one has accomplished as much and garnered as much respect and influence as Secretary Paulson has in building and advancing the bilateral relationship between China and the United States. So without further ado, please join me in warmly welcome Secretary Paulson. And so Hank and Larry, the podium is yours.
Fred, thank you for that overly generous introduction, and thanks to the university and to all of you for being here today, and for Larry to agreeing to do this. I'm greatly honored to be interviewed by him. It's really fun for me to be back. Can you all hear me? Now you can, okay. So it's really fun for me to be back in the city. I used to come frequently when I ran Goldman Sachs, and now I'm going back and forth to China, but I hadn't been to Hong Kong since, I guess I've got to put this right up to my mouth. Almost like I'm eating an ice cream cone, right, or the microphone. But, so I was last here in 2011, but yesterday morning, Wendy and I went out with the members of the Hong Kong Birdwatching Society. We are at Maipo looking at migrating shorebirds. So this is, you've got the beautiful, beautiful skyline and the vibrant city, and you've got a great, vibrant wetland. And anyway, I'm delighted to be here.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to interview Secretary Paulson. And as you can tell, he is an old friend of Hong Kong and China. I mean, going to Maipo, that is really, I'm really impressed. But anyway, since we are here on a book launch today, I want to start by asking Secretary Paulson the following question. Hank, why did you write this book?
Well, interesting. I'm not a natural author, and I labored over On the Brink, which was a story of the financial crisis, which created certain tensions at home. And so when I told Wendy I might write a book about China, she said to me, I think I might start dating again. So, but in all seriousness, I dedicated this book to my grandchildren because I want them to grow up in a safe world, an ecologically and environmentally sound world, a prosperous world. And I think there's a much greater opportunity, a chance that they will do so if the US and China are working in complementary ways rather than working at cross purposes with each other. And I believe very strongly that this is by far the most consequential bilateral relationship. It's going to be increasingly challenged and difficult. I published the book first in the US in spring of last year, and as we published it here, I looked at it again and I wouldn't change a word because I think the points I made are even more relevant today as we, when we look at the stress this relationship is going to be under. And if we want to deal with some of the threats we've got, like, driving global and sustaining global economic growth, dealing with the risk of climate change, denuclearization, combating terrorism, they're all going to be easier to deal with if we're working in a complementary way with China. So that's why I wrote it.
Thank you. Let me follow up with another question. Secretary Paulson, you have retired from Goldman Sachs some time ago. You've retired as Treasury Secretary. We are just wondering, what are you doing with your spare time nowadays? And I think you have founded the Paulson Institute. The Institute is not well known in Hong Kong. I wonder whether you can explain to us what the Paulson Institute has been trying to do.
Well, I think, and I think probably everybody in this room feels the same way. We all want to make a difference and figure out what it is we can do where we make the biggest difference. And I've had a long interest in conservation, environmental protection. I've had a long interest in economic policy. I believe sustaining economic growth is very important. And I have long-standing relationships in China. And so, given the importance of US-China relationship and given how much I care about those other topics, I established a not-for-profit institution, the Paulson Institute. We have people, we have about 15 people in Beijing, we have people in Chicago, we have office in Washington. I call it a think and do tank. The mission is to advance sustainable economic growth while protecting and environmental protection in each of our countries. And we have programs that are aimed to do that. We have programs to promote cross-investment between our two countries. I care deeply about wetlands conservation, so we'll be going from here to Beida, where we're going to have a program on conservation of wetlands because the Paulson Institute has done some real work on that in China. We care deeply about the environment, so we have programs to work with the Chinese government as they work to mitigate the impact, to clean up their environment and to mitigate the impact of climate change. Programs where we're working with them on green finance and bringing clean technologies to China. So sustainable urbanization. We have, I like to work jointly with business, so I still work. I see a number of business friends in the audience. And so we have a US-China Council on Sustainable, CEO Council on Sustainable Urbanization, where again, the focus is on greening supply chains, energy efficiency. So again, but the overall focus, strengthening US-China relations.
Thank you. In preparation for this interview, I actually read your book, the English edition, from cover to cover. And I recommend it. I mean, if people want to read it. My questions are following. If you read the book, you'll find that Secretary Paulson has been a close friend and advisor to the Chinese government at the highest level. And my question to him, though, is this. And he started this long before he became the US Secretary of Treasury, a long history of association. But I want to ask him the following question. What do you find to be the most difficult part dealing with China and with the Chinese?
Larry, that's an interesting question because of course we have very different cultures, very different histories, very different political systems, very different life experiences. But what I've found is that there are, strong similarities. So the people relations has never been a challenge for me because I find, I very much like the Chinese people. We have similar senses of humor. Americans and Chinese are both very pragmatic. The Chinese look everywhere in the world for best practices and then look to adopt them in China, adopt them in China. So that hasn't been, I'm not saying the cultural differences aren't real, but to me, the number one issue I have is contending with vested interests. People don't like change. Vested interests particularly don't like change. And so the story of the first part of the book is working with people like Premier Zhu Ranji and Wang Qishang, and I see Lu Mingkong here, people like Lu Mingkong, and working to make difficult structural reform. And there's always resistance, and so it takes strong political will and you have to do very, very difficult things. And I watch these leaders do difficult things. And of course now as China is much more rich and powerful, the vested interests are stronger. And they've got theirs, and so the question is, some of them don't want to open up and do things that are necessary for the good of China. And there's still, many, many poor people in China, and China desperately needs to continue with economic reform. And so, to me, the frustrating thing today is those vested interests, because I think China's future and economic future and prosperity rests with continuing to make difficult structural reform, breaking up oligopolies, putting the state-owned enterprises on a level playing field, because the private sector is the future of China. And so, to me, what frustrates me is resistance to that change, and because I think President Xi Jinping's vision, the reforms he's outlined, are the right reforms. And I give this leadership team a lot of credit for those reforms. But getting some of those done are going to be very difficult, and it's going to take strong political will, particularly dealing with the state-owned enterprises.
Yes, I agree. I think that taking on the reform of state-owned enterprises is going to take a little while longer. I want to follow up with the following question. In 1978, when China began this reform, the Chinese GDP at the time was only 5% of the US GDP. Today is almost, but not quite 60% of US GDP. Have you found that this actually has affected the attitudes, the behavior of the Chinese you come up with, that is it becoming more difficult to deal with people who've become wealthier, richer, and who think that they have got it right?
So Larry, another excellent question, because I'm going to look at it over 2 periods of time. So if you say, looking at the last 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, there's no doubt that this is a different China today than it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago. And this relationship, and it's a different United States of America, this relationship is more challenging, okay? No doubt about it. On the economic front, China is as they're moving up the value-added chain, they're competing more directly with major U.S. companies. So that competition makes the relationship more difficult. And as China is as a much more assertive and active foreign policy, as their interests have increased around the world, and as they're using their clout to achieve their objectives, sometimes those run counter to U.S. objectives. There's clearly more security competition in Asia. So all of this makes the relationship more difficult. And then today, this protectionist sentiment, which is very, very, to me, I view this as a very serious problem, because this economic relationship between our two countries benefits both of our countries, and it's going to be very challenging to keep the momentum going behind trade and cross investment. So the key here is to do things on both sides to mitigate the competition, to keep it a healthy competition, not debilitating competition or even conflict, and to find areas where we have many areas where we have shared interest. I talked about those earlier. But we need to turn those into actions that where there are tangible results, and both public can see the benefits of those. And so I think that's critically important. But I want to look back and take a longer view. So sure, it is more difficult. This is a different China. The Chinese leadership uses the new normal to talk about the slower growth. At the Paulson Institute, we talk about the new normal to talk about new national security policies, foreign policies, a lot of changes going on within China. But if I look longer, if I go back to the days before President Nixon went to China, China was an enemy of the United States, and was exporting revolution and fighting a proxy war with us in Vietnam, and was closed off from the international community. Now China is integrated into the global economy, into a rules-based system of global governance. So that's a positive. And when I always remind people on the economic side, when there's tension, and I say, the nature of economic relationships there's tension. If you look back 30 years ago where we didn't have an economic relationship, we didn't have tension. Okay, we didn't have economic tension. Now we've got a relationship that benefits both countries enormously, and we need to fight to keep that relationship, because I got to tell you, it will hurt both countries if we engage in a round of protectionism.
I also understand, Secretary Paulson, that you've been often asked by the Chinese leadership as to how China should deal with the United States. Now, I want to ask you a specific question. How would you advise the Chinese government to deal with a possible Trump presidency or a possible Clinton presidency?
Well, I could make a joke, because if people said to me in the U.S., what was a Trump presidency mean for U.S.-China relations, if someone said to me a big meteor was about to, asteroid was about to hit planet Earth, how would that deal with U.S.-China? U.S.-China wouldn't be my first concern. So I've got to say that I don't think Donald Trump is going to be president of the United States, but but I'm going to answer your question, and I'm going to say, what do I think? How would I advise the Chinese leaders to deal with the United States when we have a much more difficult? We're going to have new political. Both countries are going through political change. There are real challenges. And the key thing about Donald Trump is he has hit a responsive chord with the American people, who are very concerned and angry that the federal government hasn't done the kinds of things they'd like to see it do. They're unhappy that we're not growing quicker, and there's been big disruptions in the labor markets. Now, I believe those disruptions are less about trade and more about automation and technology, which are displacing workers in certain areas. At the same time, it benefits our society. So that is a continuing issue, and that's something that the Chinese side needs to be aware of, just like we see growing, protectionist sentiment in China. So here's what my answer would be. First thing, I think it's very important to continually emphasize that China's interest in maintaining global stability and in peace, because we live in an increasingly difficult world where there are many challenges, and so I think I would start there, number one. The second thing I would say is I think it is very important for China to continue reform and opening up its economy to U.S. business, because I'm increasingly hearing U.S. policymakers talk about reciprocity and saying, why should we keep our markets open if China isn't opening theirs? Now, I look at it selfishly as a citizen of the United States, and I look at it and say, we benefit from investment. We benefit from trade. So we close our markets, we hurt ourselves. But I also make the case it's going to be easier to fight to keep our markets open if China is continuing to open their markets. And so I think being clear that China is committed to opening its markets and showing that they're doing that. I think that is something that is very important. I think when you look at foreign policy, and I talked about that earlier, China is more active, okay? It used to be, was it Deng Xiaoping who said, bide our time and focus on domestic issues. China is now much more active in the foreign policy area. And when we have the security competition and so on, I think it's very important. Transparency, good channels of communication. That's why I think the strategic and economic dialogue is so important. So regular contact between the top leaders of both countries. So you have a relationship, you have a framework, because problems are always going to come up, and then you have a basis and a relationship to address those. So it's a great communication, but I'm going to come back to what I said earlier. We need to do things to mitigate the differences, deal with them up front, but let's not let them preclude working together. And so at the end of the day, the most important thing by far is to get things done that are benefit both countries, and both countries can see it. Whether we're working in the environmental area, climate change, whether they're trade deals, or doing something really important, which is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, because that's another area. When we talk about areas of potential conflict, that the urgency and the immediacy of that threat is much greater. And so there's going to be a tendency for voices in the U.S. to say, is China enabling North Korea? So that's a challenge. The opportunity is to work together to denuclearize the peninsula and deal with this threat.
I agree with you. North Korea can blow up at any time. That is really something that has to be taken care of. But I want to ask you a different problem. I mean, if you were in the shoes of the Chinese government, if you were in the shoes of the Chinese government, Chinese leaders, how would you handle the South China Sea and the East China Sea problems?
Well, Larry, you're giving me all the easy ones, right, today. And here's what I say about the South China Sea, because I get asked about that a lot. And this is, first of all, it's a very complex issue, diplomatically, politically, militarily, legally. When you look at the territorial disputes, there's good arguments on each side, and I think it's very important that we don't take sides on the legitimacy. So the position that the United States takes, and I very much agree with it, is that these should not be solved through force or coercion or the threat of force. And that because what that does is the worst case, it spills over into real conflict, okay, and that's unthinkable. But I also think I see economic challenges all over the world right now, and serious economic challenges. And so economic integration and linkages in Asia are very, very important. And I think that, and I think tension or the threat of force in the South China Sea threatens those economic linkages, which are very important.
But what should the Chinese government do? That's my question.
I've answered it, Larry. Okay, I've told you. I've told you that one in the sense that, again, I think that these need to be solved peacefully, and they need to be solved not through coercion or the threat of force, and I think it is very, very important that. And the United States has a strong interest, and I think the region has a strong interest for, free navigation according to the international laws of the sea. Keeping those routes open, and so I think that is very important. And I think that the Chinese government needs to understand it, needs to understand how important that is to the region and to the U.S. government.
Right. One other topic that you brought up, but when you were Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, I think you started exploring the bilateral investment treaty between China and the U.S. And I think it's a good thing that it should be done. But what do you think are the obstacles to finalizing it? Because negotiation has been going on for years. And I think this is the right time because the Chinese are now ready to invest overseas. I mean, you can say that 10 years ago, they were not ready. But now, China is ready to invest. And I think the Chinese market has been growing very fast. And it would also be, I think, be smart for U.S. firms to start also invest in China. So, so my question is that, do you think it's likely that this treaty will be will be done soon? And if not, what are the obstacles?
Well, first of all, the obstacles are many because there's nothing in this world that's worthwhile that's easy. Okay, this is very, very important. And it's important on a number of levels. But I want to step back and first say that I believe that our two governments are negotiating very hard right now, China and the U.S., and they're making real progress. And I wish that it had moved quicker. I wish it had been completed, but I think there's a fighting chance to complete it this year. And I think it's going to be much easier to negotiate it with this administration than with the next administration. And so I would start there. The second thing I would say is that this is a high standards bilateral investment treaty has the benefit of facilitating investment in each country, which I think is really good because these form permanent economic linkages. They create jobs, they benefit investment, benefits Chinese investment in the U.S., benefits the U.S. It's a vote of confidence in the U.S. economy. U.S. investment in China has benefited China. And I also look at these as more permanent linkages. then, you know, it's a benefit to the U.S. when China buys U.S. Treasury securities, but they can sell those tomorrow. You know, a direct investment is an important linkage. Now, lastly, the other huge benefit is it's a lever that reformers can use to open up more of the Chinese economy to healthy competition, which will make a big difference. And I'll use one example. Okay, capital markets. I can't think of a major advanced economy that's an efficient economy that doesn't have world-class capital markets. There aren't any. And I can't think of, you can't have world-class capital markets unless you let best-of-class institutions come in and compete. And so investment caps, I don't think work in finance. I've run a global investment bank. It's hard to do it if you run it with complete control. Joint ventures don't work in finance. So, and I really think if China wants to continue with its reform of its currency, it needs competitive capital markets. It needs, you know, capital markets are the grease that are going to make the economy run. And so again, a bilateral investment treaty, again, I think would open up finance. And China has come a long way just in agreeing to negotiate this, agreeing to come up with a negative list. They've made great progress. I think that's a big positive in and of itself. And what are the obstacles? What was the first question you asked me? What frustrates me? Okay, vested interest. The obstacles are vested interest. You know, no one, if you're running a company, you like competition in every area other than your industry. Okay, and so every CEO says, I like competition, but guess what? They like it in someone else's industry, and they're busy lobbying their regulator. Oh, competition is going to hurt the Chinese economy. You know what I say to that? BS.
I am afraid I have to agree with you. Since you mentioned the word currency, I think the renminbi exchange rate is or used to be a huge topic in the US. And I just want to ask you a simple question. Do you think the current exchange rate of the renminbi vis-a-vis the US dollar is overvalued, undervalued, or just about right?
Larry, that's another one I'm not going to answer, okay? Because and I'll tell you why I really don't think it's right to try to answer that, because I don't know, and I'll say a couple things. First of all, China is committed to reforming their renminbi. They've made huge progress in doing that, and there's no doubt about it. And they're moving toward a market-determined renminbi. And the U.S. has got it all wrong when people criticize China for manipulating their currency down. They've been propping it up largely for the last year and a half. So that's a bad rap. So I look forward to the day when China has a truly market-determined currency, so we don't have to answer your question, okay? And to get there, you need to have a currency that's market-determined, an open capital market, freely convertible, and you're going to need a competitive, open financial system. So that's why I used that example when we talked about the bilateral investment treaty to get there. But today, the big issue in the U.S. used to be currency when I was Treasury Secretary. To now it's this massive excess capacity in areas like steel. And that's the big explosive issue. And that's the issue that more than anything else could start a trade war, okay, and that kind of thing. So those are so that's really what I think where the people that understand what's happening, that's where their focus is. But we still hear a lot of talk by people who haven't really kept up with what has happened about currency.
Question before we open up to the floor. I agree with U.S.-China relation is probably the most important bilateral relationship in the world today. The one thing about these relations is that the expectations about the future can drive these relations. And whether China and the US will become friends, we hope friends, but become foes in the future is something that could be driven by self-fulfilling expectations. If you think someone is going to be your friend and you behave accordingly, you will become friends. But if but both sides think they will eventually become enemies and they act accordingly, they might eventually wind up being enemies. Now, I think China and the US should really work hard at building trust. And I want to ask you, as someone who's been dealing with China all these years, how do you think we should start building trust between the two countries?
Well, Larry, first of all, talking about this Thucydides trap, which is, when you look in history, you can't find examples of a rise of a predominant power and a rising power where they don't come to blows. Now, I don't think that anything is inevitable, and I don't think that's inevitable with the U.S., China, and it's unthinkable. But there's no doubt that there are people in China that believes the U.S. is looking to contain China, despite all that the U.S. has done to help bring China into the global financial system and opening up its markets. And there's people in the U.S. that are very concerned about things they're seeing in China and concerned about security, competition, and a range of issues. So, as you said, it comes down to establishing trust. The whole purpose behind me working to set up the strategic economic dialogue was to look for a vehicle to manage the relationship and build trust. And my own view is talking is important, but it is not sufficient. You need to get things done. And you need to expend political capital to get difficult things done in today's world. And I look at the global economy with a good deal of concern, because I look at a situation where economic policies that used to work in the past aren't working. Whether we're talking about Europe or Japan or Brazil or China or the US. And so these structural economic reform is very, very difficult. And so there's areas where the United States and China need to work together in terms of doing things that make sense economically and build trust. We're off to a good start in terms of working together on climate change, working together on Paris, and continuing with the Obama administration. And this is an area, again, where the Paulson Institute is spending a lot of time. So I can't say it enough that what it takes is, in areas where there are differences, we need to be transparent, we need to be candid, we need to be frank, we need to figure out how to manage those differences, how to mitigate the risk, but not let that preclude us from getting things done where we have shared interests. And we've got many shared interests. So the tragedy will be if we don't take advantage of those shared interests to get things done.
Thank you very much, Secretary Paulson. The floor is now, we're now open to taking questions from the floor. Anybody? Okay, could we give a mic to this gentleman up here?
Yes. Thank you, Secretary Paulson, for visiting the Chinese University of Hong Kong and sharing with us this morning. My name is Kelvin. I'm a bond fund manager. So my question is about the banking system. So you have seen Bear Stearns being acquired by JP Morgan. You've seen Lehman Brothers. And so after 8 years since the financial crisis, here we are, we have the Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank is in big trouble, despite all those bail-in mechanisms. So In your views, do you think Deutsche Bank is too big to fail? Do you think the government should bail out this bank at the brink of potential bankruptcy or other at this very critical moment? Thank you.
You heard it all right.
I got the problem, and I will try to deal with some of the question you raised, but I have, it's now been 10 years since I ran a global bank, and it has been, it's been 7 or 8 years since I left Treasury. So all I know about Deutsche Bank is what I've read in the press. So what I would say is this. I think when I look at the financial system in the United States, I think it is much stronger. The banks are better capitalized. They're better regulated. And we have the tools to manage a crisis that we didn't have in 2007 and 2008. So we have the authority to wind down a failing institution without putting it through bankruptcy. There are a number of things. The major complicated institutions where there's systemic risk have a single regulator. So there's a lot we've done. There's some things we haven't done in the US. We haven't fixed Fannie or Freddie yet. And we still have too many regulators, which is, I think, creating a real problem. Now, in the US, we did something during the crisis which was really quite innovative, and I don't think was generally understood. We recapitalized the whole banking system. We put capital into 700 banks. We were criticized for that because traditionally what you do is you just deal with failing institutions when they're failing. And so you nationalize them as they're going down. And in that case, you deal with a few serial failures, but no institution will take capital because they don't want to be nationalized. So we didn't stigmatize it. We put capital into the whole system. The Europeans took a different approach, and they nationalized institutions, and they frankly just bailed out a handful of institutions, and they never really recapitalized their banks. And so then we've had a situation where governments have been bailing out banks, which have been bailing out governments. And so I don't think the European institutions in general are as well capitalized. But again, knowing nothing and just reading the papers, I sure wouldn't be predicting another kind of event like we had in 2007 and 2008. I think the risks are much more likely to lie in other areas rather than the big banks, because people have focused so much time and attention on the big banks. And I'm more focused and concerned about areas where there hasn't been as much focus, where we've been dealing with problems, trying to deal with major economic issues through negative interest rates. And money is seeking out return, mispricing risk, so you have asset bubbles. We don't, after the Volcker rule in the US, which I don't think was a good rule, which solved the problem that didn't exist. Proprietary trading didn't create the problem, and now you don't have the sort of market making you need, and so we don't have the liquidity we need in certain markets. And so I would be more concerned about some of the shadow markets and more concerned about the risks there. But again, I can't comment on a particular institution because I'm just not close enough to it.
Thank you. Questions? Okay, maybe this gentleman, the third row. Okay.
Hui Lin from Geography Department, CUHK, and also Institute of Space and Earth Information Science here. Thank you for your conversation with Professor Lau. And my question is about the difference between United States and their allies, to deal with China. And for example, after Canadian government now announced to join the AIIB, and what about the US government's attitude? And also like European Space Agency enlarged their cooperation with Chinese Ministry of Science Technology for space technology. And even NASA president went China would like to promote cooperation, but Congress just stopped with ITAR and all this kind of issue. And I would like to know what's your opinion in the future, deal with China. What's the difference between US and now the partner allies?
Actually, let me just briefly paraphrase the question. The question that this gentleman raised is that he observed that the United States and its allies, for example, Canada and Europe, actually deal with China, have been dealing with China very differently. For example, Canada joined the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and also the European Space Agency has entered into cooperative arrangements with the Chinese Space Agency. But this hasn't happened with the US space efforts. So he's asking comments why there are.
Right, so you cover a number of issues. So the Asian Infrastructure Bank, that is an issue I've spoken about a number of times, because again, I believe here the US government had initially the wrong policy, because the US doesn't do infrastructure funding. China is a leader in infrastructure funding around the world through the China Development Bank, the Exim Bank. This is, so I think the right approach from the US should have been to support that initially. And even if the US government didn't put money in, should have been supporting that, because I think that's a good thing. And again, so I would, that's my comment there. But overall, the US and their allies, the US has a different position in the world than any of our allies. So we are, and so we are going to do things where I think, I see the US as playing a very, very important leadership role. We have different interests in some instances than Canada. We have different interests sometimes than our allies in Europe. But again, overall, the US policy has been, and I believe will continue to be the same as our allies, which is to bring China into a rules-based global system of governance, particularly economic governance. And so I think that is by and large the policy of the US and our allies.
Thank you, Secretary Paulson. One more question. Let me see, the gentleman at the very back. Yeah.
Good morning, Mr. Paulson. I'm a freshman here at the Chinese Studies Center at CUHK. So my question is, in July, a former top foreign policy maker of China, Dai Bingguo, made a statement publicly about the International Tribunal judgment of the South China Sea conflict. And he called it a waste piece of paper. That's a very rare action for a retired former Chinese official. So do you think that it resembles a shift toward a more aggressive foreign policy of China under President Xi's administration? Thank you.
Yeah, there's, I would say, as I think I've said earlier a number of times, that you see that China has a more assertive foreign policy. There's no doubt about it. And we've talked about tensions in the South China Sea. And I've been clear there that I think these differences need to be resolved unilaterally. Excuse me, not unilaterally. They need to be resolved amicably, and not with force or the threat of force. I believe very strongly in international law. I believe in the international law of the sea, okay, and navigation and freedom of navigation. But again, my comment I made before stands, and so I really do think that these are complex issues, and they're complex politically, they're complex legally, they're complex diplomatically, they're complex militarily, and so again, the position in here, I have no different position than my government's position. The position of my government is, let's resolve these amicably, and again, a major priority is the freedom of navigation.
Thank you. One last question, lady over there. Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Paulson. I'm Phoenix TV's presenter. You have already shared the reasons why you spend so much time on China. Is there anything you want to share, the reasons why you spend so much time on China with teenagers and students of Hong Kong and Taiwan? Thank you.
The question is that I think she appreciates the fact that you spend so much time with China and in China. And she's asking why you're spending time now with young people in Hong Kong.
Okay, why am I spending time here? Let me say I love this city, and I wish, I used to go throughout Asia, and I would go frequently to Hong Kong. We have a big office here at Goldman Sachs, and to Taiwan, a lot of time in China. But right now, I've got several things I'm doing. We talked a little bit about the Paulson Institute. I also co-chair a Latin American Conservation Council, where I spend a lot of time in Latin America, again, working on programs to save the forests and conservation programs there. I'm working on a major initiative on the economic impact of climate change in the U.S. and how to eliminate, or not eliminate, but minimize the economic risk from climate change in the U.S. So there aren't enough hours in the day for me to travel to all the spots I'd like to travel. So when I'm here, when I was out at MIPO, looking at the avocets and looking at the green shanks, I was saying, boy, I wish I were here more frequently. But there's not enough time to be here quite as much as I'd like to, but I'm glad I'm here today with you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary Paulson. We are really delighted and honored to have you here. Let us give another big hand for Secretary Paulson.